A voice cried out from the YouTube, "Who is going to explain to us how to reduce ES and SD?" And I replied, "Here am I. This is not easy to explain. I've been through several iterations, trying to explain the results of computer simulations, the mathematics behind them, the statistical bases for any of these decisions, and how to calculate what you need in order to get better with your extreme spread and standard deviation, and how to tell whether it's better or not with your chronograph." In the end, I failed miserably. So I'm starting over from the beginning here. I don't want you to look like my dog who's laying in the corner. It's boring, eye-watering stuff when we get into the nuances of the mathematics, and I've found a new way to explain it to you. In order to explain this, let's use the concept of stacked tolerances. Now, tolerances are deviations from the nominal value. The nominal value is, for the purposes of this video, defined as the intended average value. In other words, it could be length, it could be weight, or it could be velocity. And that's what's important here, is velocity. But let me give you a quick demonstration on stacked tolerances. Let's take a few bullets here. Now, the nominal weight of these bullets is 40 grains. Yet, when I take 10 of them and put them on the scale, I don't get exactly 400 grains because they all have tolerances. And those tolerances stack up. Now, if I take another 10, I get a different value. And that's the point. Every time you stack multiple units of value together, the differences in values tend to cancel each other out some. And yet, you still get a deviation from your nominal value for the combined whole. Now, I can explain the math all day on this, but realistically, I don't need to teach you how to do the math. I need to teach you what you need to do to reduce your extreme spread and standard deviation, and what you need to know as you do this process so that you don't get to chasing your tail, and to take some of the assumptions out of the process, because making assumptions makes an out of you and me. When we go to reduce ES and SD, we have one question to answer before we can do anything with it, and that is whether the variable we are looking at has any effect on the velocity. There is only one way that I know of to test this, and that is simply to take the two extremes of value that you're testing and shoot those to compare average velocity between the two groups. For example, if I had light primers and heavy primers and everything else in between, I would take the 20 lightest and the 20 heaviest and shoot groups with those, interspersed with each other round robin for obvious reasons, and look at the difference in average velocity between them. If there is a significant difference in average velocity, not statistically significant, but significant enough that you can tell the difference, that is large in nature, then that's something you need to control. The same goes for things like bullet weight, bullet shank diameter, case internal capacity, flash hole geometry, case neck tension, bullet seating friction, striker spring weight, striker spring age, firing pin fall. There's more variables than you can shake a stick at. And you just need to work your way through all of them to figure out what is worth working on. Let me give you a start on what you need to work on. Let's start with something simple like bullet weight. Now, when we start sorting by bullet weight, we know intuitively that a heavier bullet is going to leave the muzzle slower than a lighter bullet. So variations in bullet weight are going to increase your extreme spread and standard deviation some. Well, surprise, surprise, there's another factor that you may not have considered, because ES and SD only really has a major effect on your impact points at longer ranges, where those differences in velocity turn into vertical dispersions. And those vertical dispersions can get rather large at times if your velocity variations are big enough. But when you increase the weight of the bullet, it also commensurately increases the ballistic coefficient, which means that this slower, heavier bullet has a higher BC than the faster, lighter one does. And they tend to cancel each other out some, depending on how far you're shooting. So it may not be worth worrying about that first. Let's take another example. Powder weight consistency. Now, we can weigh charges on a 1/10 scale, as I've shown before, and get pretty good resolution. But if we do it a little sloppily, and we have plus or minus maybe half a tenth or a little more, and then we go to a milligram scale, what does that do to our velocity variation? Well, it's obviously going to reduce it some, and it's going to be dependent upon the size of the cartridge that you're shooting it through. A .223 Remington is going to react far differently from a 50 BMG. Some of these things are caliber and cartridge specific because the sensitivity to certain things is different from cartridge to cartridge. But in the end, what we learn in one cartridge in one barrel translates pretty well to the next one. That's been my experience. The next thing that I like to point out to people is primers. We work so hard to get our powder charge exactly the same from cartridge to cartridge, and we buy a commercial primer off the shelf, and we have no idea what the charge is in each primer. And as a matter of fact, I sort primers by weight. I'm sure this is a surprise to some of you and to many of you that think it's a waste of time. Let me explain why it's not. We're going to go to the math for just a moment, but understand that I'm not teaching a math class here. I'm not going to teach you how to do the math. I'm going to explain to you what happens when we do something. Let's say, for instance, we have an ES of 20 feet a second. Now, with our 20 foot a second average ES for our barrel, hopefully taken over a very large sample size, we're going to go in and we're going to do our test on our primers. And what we find when we do the test, this is an example, not exact test data. I do have exact test data over on Patreon for the patrons. We find that our primers change the average velocity from the lightest primer to the heaviest primer by 10 feet a second. And you're thinking to yourself, wait, I have 20 and I can take 10 off? That makes it 10? Woo, that's going to be great. Doesn't work like that. Please, just hang on for a second. When we have an ES of 20, that is the sum of multiple variables that some are canceling each other out and some are adding to each other, it doesn't quite work that way. In fact, when we do the math, we find out that taking that 10 feet a second out by sorting those primers results in an ES of not 10, but 17.32. In other words, by taking those primers and sorting them, you can reduce your ES by almost 3 feet a second. And that's just one variable. There's an important point to consider here, and that is that your chronograph cannot tell you if you improved the extreme spread or standard deviation by this amount. It simply cannot due to the random selection of the other factors that affect those values. My computer simulations showed that when I reduced the impact of a single variable by this amount, the extreme spread and standard deviation indicated for any given 20-shot series had a 36% chance of having a higher extreme spread and a 25% chance of having an increased standard deviation over what it would have been if I did not make the change. In whole, the extreme spread and standard deviation for that load improved dramatically. You just can't tell with samples that small. Now you go look at other variables. Well, neck friction can have a significant effect on your velocities. So you might want to control that. The next one that most people don't understand is your seating depth. And I'm not talking about your absolute seating depth and changing it in small increments to try to get the best out of the rifle. That's not what we're talking about here. I'm talking about the concept of a no-go zone. I have a no-go zone that I don't put bullets in. Over a decade of testing on my part has shown every time that I put bullets in the no-go zone, I get bad outcomes in my velocity variation. And that's enough rounds that I believe it to be statistically significant. So here's the no-go zone. I do not seat a bullet between 5 thousandths of jam and 5 thousandths of jump, ever. It's not worth my time. As a matter of fact, if I want to know where just touch is, I can find that with the extreme spread. It's not hard to see when you start doing a large sample. The extreme spread goes nuts when you're just tickling the lands because some are touching and some are not. And little variations in your case shoulder clearance makes for variations in whether it's touching or not. As I said, I just don't go in that region. It doesn't make any sense. It's not worth my time, and I can get good accuracy somewhere else. Quick summary to all of this. 1, you need to test the extremes of anything you're going to try to sort out and see what it does to the average velocity with those two extremes. You then take the value of those extremes, and you can calculate with this equation what the difference is in your average ES or SD. Whether you're doing SDs or ESs is up to you. From there, we can start looking at other factors. The trick is to control as many factors as possible without wasting an entire lifetime sorting components unnecessarily. And that's really a balancing act. You have to find the things that do make a difference, that are significant, and put the things that don't make a big difference aside until you have time to deal with them. Because we only have so much time in this life, and I would strongly recommend that you enjoy every moment of yours. Until next time, shoot straight, do some testing, and I'll see you in the next video.